Always pay close attention to your neighbors, especially when you're buying or renting a new place. My story starts like most horror stories you read online, but there's one difference. It happened to me recently, and I came face to face with something completely beyond logic or reason, something abnormal and otherworldly. All because I chased after a low price and hastily rented a cheap yet seemingly decent place. Now I understand why I paid next to nothing for it, even though normally rent for such an apartment would be much more expensive. But let's start from the beginning. First of all, the issue wasn't with the apartment. No grandparents had died there, and it wasn't cursed by Satanists or a cult. It was just a regular 2-bedroom with some minimal renovations, and it had a charming view of the Central Park. The real issue was with the neighbors, or to be more precise, with one particular neighbor, but more on that later. This all happened just a few days ago, about 4 to be exact. I rented the apartment directly from the owners, an elderly couple who had grown tired of the city's hustle and decided to spend their retirement in the countryside. But an extra bit of cash never hurts anyone these days, right? We didn't sign any contracts. We simply agreed that I would keep things peaceful and quiet. I assured them there would be no loud parties. I'm just a simple guy from a small village, hoping to try his luck in the big city, since there are absolutely no prospects where I come from. Speaking of parties, the owners warned me right away not to be too loud because an elderly woman lived next door. Apparently, if she heard loud music, she wouldn't hesitate to call the police to get it turned down, and the person who played it too. That's how they put it, though in reality, from what they said, she was just a very old lady who didn't like much of anything. I listened to the warnings, nodded politely, and waited impatiently for the keys to the apartment and for the owners to leave. After about 10 minutes of the woman describing how beautiful and cozy their country house was, they finally left. Her husband had to practically drag her away. He must have noticed from my expression that I wasn't really interested in her stories. She was a bit odd, but seemed like a sweet person. They even offered me tea and cookies when I first arrived. At the time, I thought she was just quirky, but now I understand there was something off about her. The man, on the other hand, was a bit too serious, especially when the conversation shifted to the neighbor. The look on his face seemed to suggest they were hiding something, either about the apartment or the neighbor. But when the hallway went quiet and the front door closed behind them, I pushed all those strange thoughts out of my head and started unpacking my few belongings, quietly pleased with myself for finally leaving that small town behind and renting a decent place practically in the city center for such a low price. My excitement clouded my judgment. I didn't stop to wonder why such a good apartment was so cheap. The place was already clean, smelled homey, and there wasn't much I needed to do. Just move the remaining things into storage. My new life was starting, and I couldn't have been more excited, like a kid on Christmas morning. The smile wouldn't leave my face, and my mood was through the roof. But soon, everything would change. Very soon, I would regret ever setting foot in this building, in this apartment. For now, though, I made myself a cup of tea, sat down at my laptop, and dove into the world of the internet. I turned on some music and played games until late into the evening. As night slowly fell, the apartment seemed even cozier. It might sound silly, but after spending the entire day glued to my computer, by evening I had a bit of a headache. I got up, stretched, and decided to head outside to the store for some fresh air. And that's when it all started. I put on a jacket, grabbed my wallet, and stepped out into the hallway. As I was locking the door, which wasn't working too well, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A door across the hall was open just a crack. I turned my head slightly to see an elderly woman peeking out with one eye. Honestly, I immediately felt uncomfortable. I don't know why. She seemed like just an ordinary old lady, curious to see what kind of new neighbor she got. I turned fully toward her and politely greeted her, but she didn't respond. So I went down the stairs. I can't stand people like that. Really, is it so hard to nod your head and say, hello, especially for an old woman? I grumbled to myself as I descended to the first floor. I stepped outside. The weather was perfect. It was warm and pleasant, ideal for a walk. But I was an idiot for putting on a heavy jacket, so I unzipped it. After a stroll through the park and picking up some snacks with the little money I had left, I happily made my way back home. As I entered the building and climbed the stairs to my floor, I once again noticed, out of the corner of my eye, that same old woman. She was still peeking out from her barely open door, just like an hour ago. Had she been sitting there the whole time, staring into the void? I asked myself as I inserted the key into my apartment door. Suddenly I heard a loud whisper. It was so quiet in the building that her whisper was oddly loud and clear. I thought she was talking to me, so I asked, "Excuse me, what did you say?" She just kept whispering, staring directly into my eyes. "I didn't hear you. What did you say?" I asked again. Then, out of nowhere, she stopped whispering and shouted loudly, "Don't make noise!" The door slammed shut, echoing through the stairwell. After the bang, I heard the sound of a lock clicking shut, followed by dead silence. I stood there for 5 minutes, stunned by what had just happened. "She's definitely crazy," I muttered to myself. That slam had scared the hell out of me. What did she mean? Don't make noise? When had I even made any noise? That old woman's lost her mind. Sure, I had played some music earlier, but it wasn't loud enough to bother anyone. I brushed it off, opened my apartment door, and went inside. That encounter with my insane neighbor had sucked all the happiness out of me. My smile was gone, and I felt uneasy. As darkness fell, the apartment didn't feel as cozy anymore. A strange sense of anxiety crept over me, and to distract myself, I headed to the kitchen to make something to eat. After all, I'd been sitting at the computer all day and hadn't eaten anything. Cooking helped me take my mind off the strange events in the hallway for a bit. I accidentally knocked some freshly washed dishes off the counter while backing away from the stove as the oil popped in the pan. For a second, the loud crash of breaking plates filled the apartment, then silence. I froze in place like a child waiting to be scolded. Again, there was silence. But then suddenly I heard a knock. I initially thought I was imagining it, but no, it was real. The old lady next door was knocking on the wall, and she wasn't tapping gently, she was pounding, probably with a cane or a crutch. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. It was only 9 p.m. If it had been the middle of the night, sure, I'd understand. But what's her deal? Does she expect me not to breathe now? Furious, I started cleaning up the broken dishes. I figured she'd stop knocking eventually, but 15 minutes passed, and the banging continued. She's gone mad, I thought to myself. Once I'd swept up the pieces, I went to the wall and knocked back. The noise from her apartment stopped instantly. Finally, I thought, and returned to my laptop. But I had barely sat down when I heard something else. Now there was a voice coming from her apartment. A raspy, annoying, old lady voice. The walls between our apartments were thin, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. "Crazy old bat," I muttered. "This is ridiculous." And to make matters worse, the mumbling went on for another half hour, then an hour. My patience snapped. I stormed out into the hallway and pounded on her door, but nobody answered. I knocked again, 1 minute, 2, 3, 5, but still no one came to the door. I went back to my apartment, and finally the noise had stopped. Thank God, I thought as I sat down and put my headphones on, turning the music up. I was sitting there peacefully when, all of a sudden, I heard the doorbell ring. That unsettling feeling crept back over me, sending a shiver through my body. Slowly, I took off my headphones and listened carefully. Someone was pressing the doorbell persistently over and over. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 11 p.m. I wasn't expecting any visitors, and I immediately knew it was the neighbor again. Something must have bothered her once more. I walked to the hallway and peeked through the peephole. There she was, standing in her nightgown, thin as a rail, leaning on her cane. Her hair was all messy, like someone had woken her up in the middle of the night. She looked like a typical old woman, but still, there was something off about her. I opened the door, ready to give her a piece of my mind. "What is it this time?" I asked, annoyed. "Why were you banging on the wall earlier? You tell me to keep it down, but you're the one making all the noise." I raised my voice a little. She shushed me, putting a finger to her lips. "She'll hear," she hissed. "Who will hear?" "What are you talking about?" "I wasn't making any noise," I shouted angrily. "If you don't keep quiet, she'll hear," the old woman whispered, completely ignoring what I said. "Who is she?" I demanded. But the woman just looked at me with a strange, disapproving stare, and then shuffled back into her apartment, slamming the door behind her. That stare, it was as if she was saying, "You'll regret talking to me like that." And one more thing. Just a moment ago, the old lady had been barely standing, leaning on her cane. If it weren't for that, she would have collapsed. But as soon as I yelled at her, she practically ran back to her apartment like a teenager. That definitely struck me as odd and left me feeling uneasy, but that wasn't the end of it. When I went back into my apartment, I immediately heard quick footsteps on the other side of the wall. It sounded like someone was running in circles next door. There was no way that elderly woman could be moving like that. She was too frail, and I had just seen her shuffle back to her place. Could it be that she wasn't living alone? But that didn't make sense either. When I had peeked through the peephole earlier, I saw her enter the apartment alone. The strangeness of it all made me even more uneasy. I didn't feel like sitting at my laptop anymore, and I certainly didn't feel like sleeping. My mind started racing with thoughts about the neighbor. What was wrong with her? As my imagination ran wild, the growing sense of dread gnawed at me. Deep down, I had a feeling that this night would end in something much worse. I tried to calm myself by thinking, she's just a crazy old woman. What can she do? Besides, the landlords warned me about her, so there's no reason to freak out. But I couldn't shake the unease, especially with the footsteps still echoing through the thin walls. The constant pattering of those footsteps sent a chill down my spine. I sat there on the couch for about 10 minutes listening until the footsteps suddenly stopped. Then the doorbell rang again, followed by a knock on the door. I walked over to the hallway and looked through the peephole again. The landing was dark. Was the power out? I wondered. Squinting, I noticed a white figure moving quickly in the shadows. My heart sank. I immediately knew it was the neighbor again. What does she want now? I thought to myself, frustrated and frightened. She had probably turned off the lights herself. I had reached the end of my patience. I decided it was time to call the police. What they told me sent chills down my spine. They said I wasn't the first person to call about this tonight, or even the past few nights. In fact, the police were sick of responding to calls from this building. They told me, in no uncertain terms, that the apartment next door had been vacant for 3 years. Hearing that, I dropped the phone, paralyzed with fear. at that very moment, a loud bang came from my front door. Whoever was outside definitely didn't want me to know the truth. The door rattled from a second bang, even harder than the first. The door was old and weak, and I could see that it was starting to give way. Is she not alone? I thought, fear gripping me. The pounding on the door continued, and with it came the sound of what I can only describe as a crazed person wailing in pain or frustration. It was terrifying beyond belief. I can't even describe how scared I was. I stood there, frozen in place, not knowing what to do. I tried to pick up the phone again, but it had slipped from my hands and the screen was shattered. It wouldn't turn on. Suddenly, the banging on the door stopped, just as abruptly as it had started, and I heard footsteps retreating down the hallway, followed by the sound of a door slamming shut. What just happened? What kind of nightmare had I stumbled into? Why had the police said that the apartment was empty when I had seen that old woman with my own eyes earlier? I stood there, running all these questions through my mind, but before I knew it, I found myself walking toward the door to inspect it. The door looked terrible. After all those blows, it was barely hanging on, but despite the danger, I felt compelled to look through the peephole once more, to make sure she was really gone. I peeked through the peephole, and there she was, sitting in the corner of the landing. The moment she saw me looking, she stood up and rushed straight to my door, pressing her face against it. I jumped back in shock, retreating into my apartment, and I could see the door handle start to jiggle as she tried to open it. Then, in that same raspy, eerie voice, I heard her say, "Open the door. Open it." Her voice sent shivers down my spine. It didn't sound human. It was something deeply disturbing. She kept shouting and rattling the door, and at that moment I honestly thought I might go gray from fear. But the worst part was still to come. I backed up into the living room in small steps when I suddenly heard a loud bang, and the door swung open. The door creaked loudly as it moved. Without thinking, I leapt into an old wardrobe and froze, barely breathing. I could hear quick footsteps heading in my direction, right toward the room where I was hiding. Through a small crack in the wardrobe door, I could see her moving around the room, trying to figure out where I had gone. She was walking unnaturally fast, with sharp, jerky movements. Her head whipped around, and I got a glimpse of her. Her face was pale, her nightgown gray and dirty, and her legs and arms were thin, covered with large blue veins. Her mouth was hanging open, revealing yellow, decaying teeth. As she roamed the second room, I had a decision to make. Either stay hidden and hope she wouldn't find me, or make a run for it while I still had the chance. I chose the second option. I flung the wardrobe door open and bolted from the apartment, grabbing my sneakers on the way out. I raced down the stairs and out of the building, running straight to the park without looking back. I stayed there until morning, sitting on a bench. Thankfully, the night wasn't cold, but there was no way I was going back to that apartment. I couldn't. Still, I needed to get my things, my documents, laptop, clothes. Everything was still there. It wasn't until midday that I finally gathered the courage to return. I entered the building, climbed to my floor, and saw that the door to my apartment was wide open. The lock was broken, lying in pieces in the hallway. I rushed inside, quickly stuffed my things into a bag, and left the apartment as fast as I could. On my way out, I glanced at the neighbor's door. It was sealed with a police tape that had clearly been there for a while, possibly years. As I exited the building, I ran into another elderly woman. "So, you're moving out too?" she asked. I just hurried past her in silence, but she called after me. "You shouldn't have made so much noise. You could have lived here quietly." What the hell? I thought to myself. How did she know what happened? Or had this happened before? I didn't have any answers to these questions, and frankly, I didn't want them. I had already been through enough. I didn't tell the apartment owners what had happened, I just left. Even now, living in a new apartment, I still think back to that terrifying night and hear that dreadful voice in my nightmares. Even now, living in my new apartment, I sometimes remember that terrifying night and that nightmare of a voice. It haunts my dreams. I'm not sure if I believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but after what I went through, I can't rule anything out. There's something deeply unsettling about that place, something not of this world. And that old woman, who was she really? How could she have done those things? The landlords hadn't mentioned anything, but that police tape on her door, it raised too many questions. In the end, I never searched for answers. I didn't want to. The only thing that mattered to me was that I got out of there in one piece. The city is a strange place, full of mysteries and people you'll never truly understand. But if I've learned anything, it's to always pay attention to your surroundings, especially your neighbors. Because sometimes the things happening next door are much darker than they seem.
If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Together we can take this channel to the next level, and don't forget to check out this video.